just another backgrounder to set the scene for this discussion. The unilateral Declaration of Independence has, I think, caught most Western capitals off guard. I mean, many of the European nations have supported it to one extent or another. They have upgraded the PLO missions in many capitals in Europe. But as we've seen recently at the EU summit in Warsaw, there does not appear to be a unified EU position on this UDI. There appears to not be a consensus that can be articulated by the EU. This is, of course, no great surprise. The EU has not exactly always been of one voice, but certainly we're seeing some discord within. And on the American side, I think we've seen paralysis. I believe that we've seen an Obama administration that has not exactly known how to thwart this UDI, how to put it off. There have been some last-ditch efforts to bring the Palestinians back to the negotiating table, but as we just heard from Nabil Shah, that is not something that Abbas appears to be terribly interested in doing. So with that scene set, I would like to introduce our three panelists. You can see their full bios in your packets, but we have to my immediate left Elliot Abrams, who's a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a former deputy assistant to the President George W. Bush, and a deputy national security advisor during that administration. We have Professor Dan Shuftan, who's the director of National Security Center at the University of Haifa and a longtime consultant to Israeli leaders over several decades. And to his left is Fadi Abu Sidu, who is the representative of the Fatah Commission of International Relations.
The question put to me is how Israelis and Palestinians see the European and American approaches. Let me start with the Palestinians. Palestinians have had a wide range of relations with the United States. We're thinking back to the days of Arafat as peacemaker, Arafat as terrorist, Arafat as enemy, Palestinians as allies in the freedom agenda. I mean, this has changed a fair amount over time. There was a perception, I think, of considerable closeness between the U.S. government and the Palestinian authorities in the period of about 2004, let's say, 3 or 4, when American and European pressure forced the creation of the office of Prime Minister. And it was filled by a man named Mahmoud Abbas, going on through the Annapolis period, going on through the, let's say, the first half of this term by President Obama. That perception of closeness, that perception of alliance, of common goals is, I think, pretty well gone. And I think the Palestinian perception of the American approach, certainly, is now disappointment. The Americans, particularly President Obama, who was viewed as a sort of, whose advent to power was viewed as a great thing by most Palestinians, most Palestinian leaders, has now come to be seen by the Palestinians as someone unlikely to deliver for them, certainly unlikely to deliver for them now. And he emerges, after all, as the key obstacle to the Palestinian effort at the United Nations. The president has stated that he would veto in the Security Council any Palestinian effort to secure kind of full UN recognition of statehood. It would probably happen if not for Barack Obama. So this is a great change, and this is probably the worst Palestinian-American moment, I would say, in 7 or 8 years. There's still behind it, I think, hope. In the eyes of many Palestinians, the hope is that maybe the president's beliefs are otherwise, and in a second term, freed from American politics, maybe he could deliver for the Palestinians, put more pressure on Israel, deliver for for the Palestinians. Palestinians have, generally speaking, rolled with the punches as American presidents changed their own views. When President Clinton wanted negotiation at Camp David, Arafat came to Camp David and appeared to negotiate. I think it is an open question whether the negotiation was in good faith. It is not an open question to Bill Clinton, who would tell you the answer is no, he did not. When President Bush came and his approach was to sideline Arafat and create a new leadership, his 2002 speech, they rolled with that punch. They created at least an appearance of internal reform. And then, of course, when Arafat died in 2004, things changed a good deal. Palestinians, of course, well, I shouldn't say of course, in my view, have a bit of a problem here. On the one hand, they like it when there's tension between the United States and Israel. And there's an opportunity, in their view, to pull the Americans closer to them. But it is not actually in their interest, because it, I think as we've seen in the case of President Obama, it actually reduces the American ability to move Israeli political leaders. Today, I would say the Palestinians are just not sure where the United States is and what the United States wants. This week, sure, it's easy to say what the United States wants is for the Palestinians to desist from this effort in the UN. But go beyond that, that's September. Go beyond that to October, and I would say the Palestinians are confused about what President Obama actually wants from them during what is actually his last year in office, or his last year of his first term in office. The Arab Spring has certainly had an impact here because it has upset changed, let's say, American relations with Egypt, obviously with Syria, and it has changed Palestinian relations with one of their most important, partners, and that's President Mubarak. And it is going to bring additional pressure on them because we're in the context here of the Arab Spring. And what is the Arab Spring? It is a call on the part of populations to speak for their own country, to run their own government, to vote at a moment when the Palestinian leadership is refusing the Palestinian people the right to vote, even in local elections. Very hard, I think, to maintain that position over the coming year as election after election is held in other Arab states. Let me turn to Israel, and I know time is short. I'll try to be very brief. As with the Palestinians, there have been quite a range of relations, but it is a narrower range. The perception now is clearly of difference. As Israelis look back to the Clinton and George W. Bush periods, it is obvious that there are tensions in the relationship now that didn't exist. And I would say this is not good for the Israelis, and it is not good for the Palestinians because it clearly reduces the influence of the United States. In the memoirs of the Clinton years, Clinton himself, Martin Indyk, others, Dennis Ross, have written that they clearly found that they got a lot more out of the Israelis by hugging them than by throwing spears at them. And I think we're seeing the truth of that right now. There's another problem which I think we should not overlook, and that is there's always more tension when you have a liberal democratic president and a Likud prime minister. It's happened before, and it shouldn't surprise us. And the personality part also is a problem now. Although from the Israeli perspective, I think, they don't see the problem as the United States. They see the problem as Barack Obama. They look to Congress and see no diminution of support from 2 or 5 or 7 or 10 or 15 years ago, and believe that President Obama will be disciplined by the American political system or even replaced by it. But I think the Israelis are equally confused about what the United States wants today, beyond, again, September. In September, they know what the American government is trying to do. But they're confused, I think, because they would say there isn't a clear American policy. There was a clear American policy adopted on his second day of office by President Obama when he hired Senator Mitchell. There was an effort to get a total settlement freeze leading to negotiations. That policy was abandoned last November. Senator Mitchell departed. Since then, the only real American effort has been to stop what is happening in the United Nations this month. But beyond that, again, what happens in October and November? What do the Americans want after that? Isn't clear, and there's confusion, and the confusion itself, I think, leads to frustration on the part of the Palestinian and Israeli leadership. There's more to say because of this context of the Arab Spring, potential changes in Syria, but maybe we can get to that in the Q&A period. Thank you.
Well, the question that I was asked to answer is, what can the international community do to promote cooperative environment that is conducive to long-term stability and reconciliation in the Middle East? There's a very short answer to that: very little. And very little as long as particularly the United States and Europe start from four assumptions that have very little basis. And let me explain what those assumptions are and explain what the difficulty is in departing from it. First, the first assumption is that an Israeli-Palestinian settlement will dramatically contribute to the stabilization of the Middle East. The second assumption is that an involvement of the international community in the substantive matters, I don't mean as facilitators of negotiations, but in the substance of the negotiations, will be helpful and will promote such a settlement. The third is that you can reach an agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And the fourth is that the Palestinians are willing to accept a settlement of two states for two peoples. And I would challenge all of these assumptions, but I would go further than that. I would say that this is no longer a political and empirical issue for Americans and Europeans, for Americans with this Obama administration and Europeans. It is theological. It is an article of faith. People believe in it rather than willing to look at the experience and judge if it can work or not, and that it is not affected by historical experience that shows the opposite. And let me take all four of them and very shortly explain why I believe they have no basis. First, this idea that a Palestinian-Israeli settlement can dramatically contribute to the stabilization of the region. Everything important in the Middle East doesn't have any major effect by the Palestinian issue or Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. If you look at the most important countries in the region, what is happening in Egypt, what is happening in Iran, what is happening in Turkey, the impact of a Palestinian-Israeli understanding on this is zero. What is happening inside Egypt has no impact whatsoever. The Palestinian issue has no impact whatsoever on it. It's a question of political culture. Where is Egypt going? You have side issues, but not the core is not affected by the Palestinian issue. The question if Iran will become nuclear or not and what impact Iranian terrorism will have or the Iranian attempt to undermine the regimes in the region is not affected even in the slightest by the Palestinian issue. The counter-revolution in Turkey, when the Ataturk revolution is over, is something that the Palestinians or the Palestinian-Israeli issue had zero impact on and will have very little impact in the future. The Turks will use it for their policies, but it will not affect in a major way their policies. So the assumption, even if we had a Palestinian-Israeli peace tomorrow morning, and we're not going to have it, but even if we had it, the impact on the stability of the Middle East would be next to nothing, certainly not dramatic. The second is the belief that a substantive involvement of the international community will help bring about a settlement. I think what we've seen since Obama came to office, we've seen it before, but now we see it in the clearest way, is that not only did the Obama policy not help in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, it terminated the negotiations that existed before it, and it made a settlement profoundly impossible, at least in the immediate future. Because from the Palestinian point of view, why should the Palestinian reach a historic compromise if the American president is doing most of the work for them? And Abbas more or less said so in his interview to the Washington Post. Later, perhaps I can bring some quotations from this interview. We can just sit there and wait while the Americans are squeezing Israel. From an Israeli point of view, you have today a situation, and I don't think it is because of Netanyahu. I have very serious criticism about Netanyahu on different issues, and I very strongly disagree with him on some of his positions, but I don't think that this is a Netanyahu business. Go today much broader in the Israeli political system, and you will see it, that there is an assumption that under the prevailing circumstances and what Obama is suggesting, from an Israeli point of view, it is not worth going into negotiations because we know what these negotiations will impose on Israel. We don't know what it will impose on the Palestinians. And perhaps at this point, let me present full disclosure in terms of where I stand politically. I advocate for decades unilateral Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip and the overwhelming majority of the West Bank and the partitioning of Jerusalem. So I'm not trying here to protect the notion of let's stay there because we can't negotiate. I'm a unilateralist in this sense, and I'm advocating getting out of there without the Palestinians giving anything in return. So what I'm suggesting is not it helps my political conviction, but if I look at the mechanism, it has a counterproductive effect. The third element is, can you get a settlement with the Palestinians? There is this belief that all we need is leaders with courage, and we all know where this is going, and a settlement is imminent. We've been talking about it for decades, and the fact that it does not materialize is not an accident. Let us look only on the major impediments that make it impossible for the foreseeable future. First of all, without Gaza, you cannot have a lasting settlement. And with Hamas, you cannot have a settlement. And at least for the foreseeable future, this is something that we cannot change. The second point is that Abbas and Fayyad are people that from an Israeli point of view are very positive. Abbas was always against the Arafat terrorism, and he is against what he calls the militarization of the Intifada, even in the year 2000. And Fayyad is the first Palestinian leader who really tries to do something constructive with the Palestinian people. But they cannot deliver. If they come to the Palestinian people and say, we have to give up the right of return, nobody will even take them seriously. They're incapable of delivering. They're incapable of delivering not only Gaza, they're also incapable of delivering the West Bank. The third point was mentioned here before concerning the security considerations. It's not just the electromagnetic field, it's also the question of the airspace and other things. I don't think that this has an answer. And the atmosphere that you have today in the Arab world, in what you call an Arab Spring, makes the situation of an Israeli-Palestinian settlement more difficult, not more easy. You cannot, under the prevailing circumstances today in the Arab world, get an Arab support for a willingness of Palestinian leaders to reach a historic compromise. And of course, if you look at Israel, we will have to root out at least 100,000 people in the West Bank. And again, personally, I advocate it. I believe it's a good idea. Can you do it now in the regional environment that we have and with Obama as a president? I don't think so, at least not in the immediate future. And the last point is, are the Palestinians willing to accept the notion of 2 states for 2 nations? Let me remind everybody that Olmert proposed to the Palestinians a Palestinian state on 100% of the territory they have lost in 1967, including, actually not they have lost, Jordan has lost because there was no Palestinian state, but Jordan has lost in 1967. And Saeb Erekat, the chief negotiator, even said, we got 100% from Olmert. And Abbas said that Olmert was even willing to accept the principle of some return only in very small numbers that would not mean what they want, namely millions to return to the West Bank. And this concept did not work. The idea that they got 100% brought Saeb Erekat, their chief negotiator, to say, in Camp David we got more than 90, now we got 100, if we stall it for longer, we will get more. Why should we settle now if we, later, by the way, I can bring you all the quotes. I have them here, and if you want the full text, I'll give you the full text of the quotes. Why should we settle for less if we can get more? I see that my time is running out, so let me just make one comment and then give one quotation in full. The Palestinians are not willing to accept that there is a Jewish people. They speak about Judaism as a religion, not as a peoplehood, and therefore they're not willing to accept that Jews have a right for self-determination and the establishment of a Jewish state that reflects the right of the Jewish state for self-determination. They're not willing to accept it. And I doubt, I will perhaps develop it later, and I'll be delighted if somebody will ask me about it, I doubt if they even want a state. Because being now the ultimate victim that the whole world loves and getting billions of dollars and having no responsibility whatsoever is something that they like. Otherwise, why do they reject a Palestinian state since 1978? Even Arafat said that more than 30 years ago they could have developed the autonomy plan into a Palestinian state. But let me end with a very short quotation from Mr. Nabil Shat that is sitting here with me in an interview to A&B TV on July 13, 2011. He said, the story of two states for two peoples means that there will be a Jewish state over there and a Palestinian state over there. We will never accept this. We will never agree to a clause preventing a Palestinian refugee from returning to their country. The issue is it is not ripe to reach a Palestinian state at the moment in agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, something that the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank and Gaza can accept, and any kind of Israeli leadership can accept, and therefore we should look elsewhere and certainly not start from assumptions that lead us nowhere. Thank you.
I would like to start my presentation by answering the same question that Professor Shifton just started his presentation with. What can the international community do to promote cooperation environment? And the answer to that is very simple. Set the parameters for negotiations and terms of reference clear. And I believe this is a very focal point in analyzing and understanding the dynamics that have been going on over the past few months when it comes to European, American, Palestinian, and Israeli relations. Over the past few years, we've been witnessing a consistent campaign to transform the conflict and the way the West Bank and the Palestinian territories are viewed from an occupied territory into a disputed territory. And this is where the problem starts. The Palestinians, through their initiative at the United Nations, are trying to make the terms of reference clear, relaunch negotiations in the future on clear parameters with no confusion, and put an end to this Israeli campaign that unfortunately have gained momentum lately in transforming, reintroducing the Palestinian territories as disputed and not occupied. And if you take that into consideration when viewing American position and a European position, it all will start to make more sense. The dynamics, how they're going on, and when it comes to the American administration specifically, Obama administration does not want to be the only veto in the Security Council once again. And it is doing a lot of work in order to make sure that it's not placed in the same position once again. Unfortunately, the American administration tools for changing the process, for influencing that, well, are limited and counterproductive in a way. And I would disagree with Mr. Abrams in terms of concluding that the U.S.-Israeli relations, when they are bad, they result in reduced influence, reduced American influence over Israeli politics. I would rather say that it's more due to the internal American dynamics. The American administration's influence over Israel is reduced. If we view what was going on in the United States, Obama speech, how he was put in a position to reinterpret his words again, the position he was put on as a White House versus Congress when Netanyahu made a speech at the Congress, got 32 standing ovations by congressmen before they actually heard what he was saying. The moment Netanyahu said, Israel will not, he will be applauded, the whole audience will stand up, support him, regardless of what he was saying. And that confrontation between the White House and the Congress, this internal American disagreement over the American approach toward Israel, how the American administration should proceed, to what extent the American administration should pressure Israel, is what is causing the American administration to have less tools of influence over Israel. It's not the worsen American-Israeli relations due to an American administration initiative. On the contrary, the Obama initiative did not produce results due to this internal conflict, internal dynamics within the American politics itself. And another component that's very key here when examining European and American and Arab positions vis-a-vis Palestinian initiative is the reconciliation agreement. As Palestinian Authority, as PLO, as Fatah political party, we've been hearing a lot of criticism for the lack of unity, for elections, for withholding in elections, for delaying elections, for the continuous disagreement with Hamas over positions. We've been trying hard to make sure that the Palestinian position come September is unified. The Arab Spring was a very crucial and vital component for allowing the Palestinian reconciliation to happen, to take place. The parameters and the background for these reconciliations were no different than what was accepted, agreed upon by the Arab states in the past in the form of the Egyptian paper. And this reconciliation agreement with the component defining the parameters for reforming PLO, for defining the time and place for new parliamentary and presidential elections, paved the way for a much more positive response and support by the Arab members and by the Europeans in specific, which allowed and paved the way for our efforts to gather support for the Palestinian recognition campaign. It is a very vital component, and I must highlight that since the reconciliation agreement was reached, violence, tension have been reduced tremendously. And this links up to the regional component. And I do not want to go on and on because I want to leave stuff for the following panels. But on the regional component, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the cause for the current tensions between Turkey and Israel. And Turkey is a very key regional player in so many files in the Hamas reconciliation agreement, Hamas-Fatah reconciliation agreement, in various negotiations between Israel and other regional parties. In the current crisis happening in Syria, it's a member of NATO. It's a very key member of the Middle East. This tension between Turkey and Israel is a direct result of the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The people who died on the Syrian borders in support of the Palestinian right, it is another example of how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can transform into a regional level. The rhetoric that we constantly hear from so many parties, from so many groups, both radical and moderate and political, referring and explaining their position vis-a-vis Israel through the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Egyptian, the cross-border attack recently, and how that transformed into an Israeli bombardment over Gaza is another example of how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can take easily a regional dimension. Finally, the final component of my presentation, I would like to say what can we do and what is needed. And I do agree totally with Professor Shifton that we are beyond the need and the rhetoric of leadership. Leadership only cannot solve the problem. We are in a very, very complicated situation now where we are facing a political economic model that is profitable and supportive of occupation. And unless this particular model is replaced with an alternative model, the occupation and peace will not be economically and politically viable for any future Israeli leader. And again, I would like to conclude by saying that unless the parameters for future negotiations, the terms of reference are clear, the international community's influence will be greatly diminished. Thank you.
Fadi, I'll start with you, just a quick point of clarification. You mentioned the reconciliation efforts that are ongoing, and in fact the reconciliation agreement that was struck in the spring. I think it's quite clear that the two sides, despite this paper agreement, have not fully come together. In fact, I would argue, and I have, that they still can't agree on the color of hummus, as I've argued in the past. Would you care to clarify how this agreement is going to help the Palestinian image as it moves forward on this statehood campaign?
Yes, sure. Well, first of all, it did and it is helping. A lot of European members, international community members in Latin America, key Arab members, Jordan and Egypt, have changed their approach to us greatly and increased their support tremendously since the reconciliation agreement was signed, first of all. Second, the problems in implementation of the reconciliation agreement did not manifest itself in terms of any party withdrawing from the agreement itself, nor confrontation between the parties on the ground, and nor in a deteriorating state of security. However, it must be noted that this disagreement on first component and first step of the reconciliation of the interim government partially is due to the external influence and the external position of international community vis-a-vis who will lead the government, who they are happy to talk to, and the continuity of funds. There are other internal Palestinian components to it. However, both parties have agreed to postpone the implementation of the first component and move beyond that into implementing the other components, specifically security, PLO reform, and have committed themselves to upholding and respecting holding elections in 2012. Professor
Shiftan, you've laid out a rather bleak assessment of where things are right now. Am I correct in understanding that this is about conflict management rather than solution? And if so, just briefly lay out how you think this unilateral declaration will impact anything, if at all.
It will impact very little. I think that people who speak about solutions confuse the Middle East with a crossword puzzle. And if we look at the history of the Middle East, we see that many of the problems of the Middle East have not been solved. And to assume that this one is about to be solved is either to be completely oblivious to any factual evidence coming from the region, or, living in a world where hopes determine your analysis rather than reflecting what is happening on the ground. It is, at the moment, not a question of solutions, because I don't see anything that can bridge between Israel and the Palestinians. It is a different Israeli government would not have had a different result. I mean, look at the Olmert government. Olmert went beyond what I think many Israelis in the mainstream was willing to do, and it produced nothing. So a different government with a radically different agenda than the one that the Netanyahu government has did not produce an agreement. And if you look at the Palestinian side, I'm just listening here to what we hear about the reconciliation agreement. This has no impact whatsoever on the extremely radical and, let me add, anti-Semitic position of Hamas. And when they shell Israeli cities and they believe that they have a right to kill Israeli civilians, then it's not even a starting point. So what can be done in terms of conflict management? I think primarily to bring down hopes that something is going to happen very soon, because then these hopes are frustrated, and this frustration in itself can lead to an eruption that at the moment neither Israel nor Abbas and Fayyad want.
And just to clarify, I mean, we heard in the previous panel, we heard Dr. Schath explain that this unilateral initiative is going to pave the way for continued negotiations, or somehow lend itself. That's something that you disagree with.
I'm absolutely sure that it cannot produce it. Now, is it possible that Israelis and Palestinians under American and European pressure will negotiate? Yes. But can these negotiations produce an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians? I don't think so. Again, the most important stumbling block is not borders, is not statehood, is not even Jerusalem. It is the right of return. Practically all Israelis of any significance totally reject it. Perhaps some are willing to accept a token, relatively insignificant issue. And I don't see any kind of Palestinian leadership, even in the West Bank, let alone Hamas. Even Abbas, even people in the West Bank are not willing to accept a total abandonment of the right of return. The right of return means the extinction of Israel. At the moment, the Palestinian position is that the area between the Jordan and the Mediterranean should be divided into two states, one that is exclusively Arab and the second that is non-Jewish. And then at the next stage, through the right of return, the non-Jewish state will become another Arab state. This is what they're talking about. No Israeli is even willing to consider it, and we've always told ourselves, no, they can't mean it seriously. They know that it will not be satisfied, and therefore they're just doing it for the purposes of negotiations. But every negotiations failed when it came to this point. This is by far more difficult than the issue of Jerusalem, than the issue of borders, than all the other issues combined.
Okay, thank you. And Elliot, just to maybe ask you to drill down a little bit on the lack of U.S. leadership. I think you've implied that in much of your writing and certainly what we heard today. Is there anything at this point that this administration can do to regain credibility? Is it, as Fadi insinuates, that it's really an issue of domestic politics and wrangling between Congress and the president, or is there a deeper issue that needs to be addressed? And do you think that if a Republican came in next year that things would change significantly?
I agree to some extent with Fadi. that there is a domestic political side here, but it is actually called democracy. That is, the reason that the president cannot change American policy into one that is far less supportive of Israel is that the American people, in vast majorities, are very supportive of Israel. That is why no president changes the policy. That is why Congress does not challenge a pro-Israel policy. And this is in a country which is 2% Jewish. It's because the vast majorities of American Christians are very pro-Israel. What can be done now? And the now, I guess, means after the UN vote and in this year before the election. Not much. I think I tend to agree with Dan that it is possible, I think. It is, I mean, after all, negotiations began a year ago. President Mubarak and King Abdullah of Jordan came to Washington, as did the Israeli and Palestinian leaderships. A negotiation was commenced. Is it conceivable that something like that could happen again in October or November or December? Sure. Sure it is. And it will blow up in another 3 weeks, as it did last time, because of these, because the issues are so difficult. And the two sides are not going to be able, I think, in this, let's just talk about the coming year, to overcome their differences. So the question then becomes, well, could you get some kind of negotiation started and string it out for a year in order to make people feel that there was some effort being made? Maybe. Particularly, it seems to me, if you could, underneath that umbrella, which might be a very weak umbrella, could you do something on the ground that would help? Could you improve Palestinian life in the West Bank in particular? Palestinian life in the West Bank has been improving for the last, well, let's say since the death of Arafat. Certainly the economy has improved. The IMF and the World Bank statistics about this are very clear. Mobility has improved. That's also very clear. So that could happen, and I think that would be a very intelligent thing to do from both the Israeli and Palestinian point of view. The question, I think, is, will the administration, will the Obama administration seek that kind of pragmatic, small but steady gain, or will it basically say, we don't want to be interested in this, come back to us in January of 2013?